Jimmy Butler exposed the great injustice in the NBA live on air in front of all viewers. He had only said one sentence, but when he used Melania and Barron Trump as examples, President Trump went berserk. On a hot Thursday night in June, a sports hall in Los Angeles was packed to the rafters. The theme of the night was the future of sports and social equality. The lights were bright. Camera crews were set up in every corner of the arena. The panel included retired stars, young talents, coaches, and former executives. But everyone's eyes were actually on the person standing in the left corner of the panel, Jimmy Butler. He had his arms crossed over his chest, and his gaze was calm, but his posture was just as firm. Jimmy was familiar with this kind of event, but there was something different in the air tonight. The energy was strange. Everyone in the room, from sponsor representatives to young players, was strangely quiet. Then a reporter took the floor and asked his question. "Jimmy, today we're talking about the challenges young athletes face. Do you think this system treats everyone equally?" The moment had arrived. Jimmy didn't hesitate for a second. He leaned into the microphone. His voice was a little loud, but he wasn't angry. His words were clear. If Melania Trump and her son Barron came to this country today with no name, no connections, and no money, they would be excluded without question, just like hundreds of thousands of other immigrants. Because this established system works based on who you are. Unfortunately, it doesn't work based on what you know. The hall suddenly turned into a castle made of ice. The cameramen began to move behind their cameras. A spectator in the third row muttered, "I think I heard that wrong. What did he say?" The moderator blinked, but Jimmy was still sitting upright at his desk. He didn't move his hands or avert his gaze. An old actor next to him immediately cleared his throat and tried to steer the conversation in another direction. But almost everyone in the room had instantly realized the truth. This sentence would determine not only this evening, but the coming weeks. Minutes before the broadcast began, this scene had already leaked onto social media. Clips were being cut and combined with videos of immigrant families on TikTok. Hashtags were trending. Hashtag same rules for everyone. Jimmy told the truth. But at that moment, the atmosphere was very different in Washington, at the White House. Trump was having dinner in the private dining room next to the Oval Office, and the television was on. The broadcast had just begun, and Trump looked bored, playing with the meatballs on his plate. But when Jimmy's voice was heard, he suddenly sat up straight. "What did he say?" he shouted in a loud voice. He pointed at the screen. At that moment, his assistant immediately rewound what he had heard. They would be excluded like other immigrants. Trump's face suddenly turned red with anger. He threw his fork hard onto his plate. "This is nonsense. He insults my wife and then attacks my son." Trump called his press advisor, who was in the next room, and shouted angrily, "We have to shut this down before morning. Notify every unit. Show them how he attacked the children, and show no mercy." At that moment, Jimmy and his assistant, Marcus Reed, were quietly leaving the hall. They stopped at a small restaurant before getting into the car. Jimmy had been to hundreds of events like this, of course, but tonight was very strange and definitely different. Marcus adjusted his glasses and asked with a slightly nervous expression, "You realize you've just set off a bomb, right?" Jimmy was stirring his coffee at the time. He shook his head and replied, "Yes, I am aware, Marcus," he said, "but I definitely had to say it." Marcus's face looked a little tense. He wasn't just afraid of social media lynching. He was worried that there could be real threats. "The storm could start tomorrow morning," Jimmy replied without looking away. "Marcus, I'm used to weathering storms." And as soon as morning came, everything started as expected. Send Melania back. This hashtag had gone viral on Twitter. The interesting thing was that it had originally been created to mock Jimmy, but it quickly turned into a real movement. People began comparing how Melania came to the US on a modeling visa and how ordinary people were deported. Jimmy had actually only said one thing, but now it had turned from a personal issue into a systemic storm. At around 9:30 in the morning, while many people on the East Coast were still sipping their coffee, there was extraordinary activity in the White House press room. Trump took the podium much earlier than usual. His tie was crooked, his hair was sweaty at the roots, but his voice was filled with anger rather than his usual confidence. Raising his index finger in the air, he shouted in a loud, angry voice, "That despicable man! He's not a member of Congress, he's not even an NBA star, and he can't attack the First Lady of this country and my son on live television. This is not just disrespect, this is a security issue. What does it mean to attack a mother and a child? This man is sick." Standing behind her, Press Secretary Craig Bolton averted his gaze. The president's voice was echoing across television broadcasts nationwide. Some stations were broadcasting live, while others were displaying subtitles that distorted Jimmy Butler's words. Jimmy Butler, Melania and Barron should be deported. But in fact, Jimmy had never said such a thing, nor had he implied it. At the same time, Jimmy was in Miami, in his apartment, watching television. Marcus was with him. Trump was seething with rage on the screen. Marcus grabbed the remote and turned down the volume. "This is unbelievable. They're claiming he said that, but you just gave an example." Jimmy shrugged, as if he didn't care. "The greatest weapon of those who don't want to hear the truth is to distort what comes out of your mouth." The phone wouldn't stop ringing. ESPN, CNN, even morning shows wanted to reach Jimmy. Marcus turned to Jimmy with an uncertain look on his face. "They all want to talk to you. Which channel do we choose?" Jimmy narrowed his eyes. "Just show one, CNN. Anderson Cooper. Let's not turn this into a show." By midday, Trump's advisors had even devised a new strategy. They wanted to portray Jimmy's comments as child abuse. Headlines like, "He attacked the family," were multiplying, while Trump's supporters were launching campaigns on social media to cancel Jimmy's sponsorship deals. Adidas, Gatorade, and even the NBA were keeping quiet. But this silence was almost non-existent compared to the voices echoing outside. The hashtag #SameRulesForAll had become a social movement. Thousands of young people began sharing their families' stories of immigration. A high school coach wrote, "If my son who plays ball on the streets was named Barron, maybe he wouldn't have to fight for a college scholarship today." And then, the moment arrived. At 9 p.m., Jimmy Butler was sitting across from Anderson Cooper. The studio was brightly lit, but the atmosphere was heavy. Jimmy wasn't even wearing a suit, just a plain shirt and a simple light. It was as if there was an ordinary citizen on the screen, not an NBA superstar. Anderson asked him directly, without hesitation, "Jimmy, you divided the country with what you said. Are you sorry now?" Jimmy didn't blink. "No, because what I said was never personal. It was political, even systemic. But some people are untouchable just because of their last name. Others are arrested just because they are poor or foreign. I didn't insult anyone. I just wanted them to look in the mirror. That's all." This statement echoed across the country. That night, a clip from the interview was turned into a video that a teacher showed to their students in class on TikTok. In the video, a quiet female student could be heard saying, "He's not afraid." But of course, not everyone applauded his courage. The next morning, Republican politicians launched a campaign against Jimmy. Congressman Travis Hunt said the following on live television, "This man may be a basketball player, but he has clearly forgotten his manners. What is it to use a mother's name and a child's life for political rhetoric?" This rhetoric, of course, grew on conservative talk shows. Some commentators labeled Jimmy a show-seeking liberal, but Jimmy remained silent throughout. He didn't back down or apologize. Because for him, it wasn't about that. It was about the truth. The next day, social media underwent a new transformation. A young TikTok user read Jimmy's words and then told the story of his mother's deportation. Hundreds of thousands of people began sharing their own stories in the same format. And it wasn't just young people. Dolores Abeck, a 74-year-old former immigrant, pointed to the Jimmy interview in a newspaper at a cafe and said, "He's not just defending our rights anymore. He's speaking for us. That's the difference." But the storm was just beginning. Trump's advisors ordered a review of all of Jimmy's sponsorship deals. The NBA management began holding internal meetings under the heading of statements contrary to community values. In short, they wanted to jeopardize Jimmy's status in the league. But people were now speaking out even louder outside, in the streets, and in every corner of the internet. Because one thing was now clear: Jimmy Butler was being silenced. but he was definitely not alone anymore. On Saturday morning, the Miami sun seemed to rise harder than it ever had before. Jimmy was on his balcony, sipping a cup of black coffee and glancing through the news. A video had gone viral on social media. A 15-year-old boy was crying in his school locker room, describing how his mother had been deported. Jimmy's words were written in the caption, "If someone without status had carried Melania's face today, they would have been greeted with a red carpet." Thousands of shares and millions of views. But this wasn't a lynch mob. It was slowly turning into an awakening. Jimmy's words were no longer just a comment. They had become a mirror, reflecting people's suppressed stories. That day, a crisis meeting was held at NBA headquarters. Some league executives brought up the idea of punishing Jimmy due to public pressure. Phrases like, "He should have been more careful with his words while representing the team," were floating around. However, at the same time, the Players' Union, NBPA, stood by Jimmy. One of the young stars sent a message to the union spokesperson. "If Jimmy is punished for this, I won't play in the next game, because he has become our voice." And of course, it wasn't just the players. Youth coaches, sports academies, immigrant families, and even some retired players began sharing messages of support. One was particularly noteworthy. "I played in the NBA for nearly 11 years. I was silent for 11 years. But Jimmy spoke up, and that man became the voice of all of us and made us feel at ease." That evening, Jimmy visited a small community center in Miami. There were no cameras. There were no journalists. It was just Jimmy and 3 immigrant families. The organizer was a former social worker named Eric Doucet. The first to speak was a woman of Latin descent. She had bags under her eyes and was holding an old photograph. "My husband was deported 2 weeks ago. He did nothing wrong. He was just a little late getting his work permit. The children still think he's on a business trip." Then the woman fell silent. Jimmy didn't look away. He clasped his hands together, his eyes filled with tears, but he didn't cry. The second story came from a former model of Serbian origin. "I am also an immigrant, but the system gave me a way in, because I had a pretty face, a good accent, and a fashion portfolio. It's a little embarrassing, but it's the truth." The last one couldn't even speak. An 8-year-old girl sat on her father's lap and drew a house on a napkin. There were little figures in front of the door she drew. Jimmy looked at the drawing and asked her, "Are they waiting inside?" Eric nodded. "Yes, they're waiting there. Maybe forever." That night, Jimmy was quiet in the car, as usual, on his way home. Marcus was fiddling with his phone in the passenger seat. Jimmy suddenly started talking. "Man, I'm not going to tell the stories." Marcus looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" he said. "They will tell them. Marcus, in their own voices. I'm just going to give them a platform." And late that night, it was shared like a chain on Jimmy Butler's official social media account. There were no hashtags. There was no logo. There was no video. There were just a few sentences and a few photos. Isabella. Her husband was deported. She is alone with her 2 children. Her documents were incomplete. She had no lawyer. Marta, a blonde model whose visa had expired, but she got her green card in almost 18 months. Ama's daughter. Her mother has been missing for 5 months. Her asylum was denied, and she still hasn't heard anything. These 3 lines were enough to dominate the headlines for the entire day. People didn't just share the story, they wrote their own stories. "My mother cleaned offices for 12 years. She was deported because of a traffic ticket. My uncle is still waiting for his trial. They lost his file. My grandmother married an American, but they considered her marriage fake. She died without ever becoming a citizen." By morning, the chain had been translated into Spanish, Korean, Arabic, French, and Farsi. Moreover, it wasn't Jimmy's team who did this, but volunteers. Some teachers opened ESL, English as a second language classes, and used the chain as teaching material. At that moment, one thing became clear. Jimmy was no longer the center of a debate, but had become a symbol of a movement. But the other side was not silent, of course. Congressman Travis Hunt shouted at a rally in Tennessee, "Of course he's playing the victim. He's trying to cover up his attacks on Trump by using his family drama." But this time, a whisper rose from the crowd. But he didn't actually attack anyone. He just made a comparison. 2 blocks away from the rally, an elderly woman in a small cafe had cut out Jimmy's newspaper clipping. She handed it to the waiter. He's not just talking about us. He's talking on our behalf. That night, Trump tweeted again. It's all fake news. This Jimmy guy's lying. The media is blowing this nonsense out of proportion. But right below this post, someone posted a photo of Jimmy visiting a community center. Jimmy was kneeling down, looking at a house drawn by a little girl. The comment below the post read, "One is shouting, the other is listening. The difference is clear." There was no turning back for Jimmy Butler now. The more they tried to silence him, the more people started speaking up for him. Whether he stopped talking or not, something was growing without him. A truth, a crack. And from that crack, brand new voices were rising. In a high school gym in Miami, a crowd had already begun to gather. Immigrant rights advocates, local youth, teachers, and youth coaches. Almost everyone had come together in the wake of Jimmy's chain reaction. Handmade signs waved in the air. My mom could have been deported. Same rules, everyone. Jimmy is our voice. There was no stage. There was no microphone. But everyone was talking. Everyone was telling their story to each other. And Jimmy's voice was gradually becoming their own. That same morning, silence reigned at the NBA's headquarters in New York. The board of directors had already convened. The agenda was clear: Jimmy Butler and the public relations crisis. Some executives wanted to bow to pressure from sponsors, arguing that the league's reputation had been damaged. These political statements must not be reflected on the court. A basketball player cannot be an activist. But then the president of the NBA Players Association took the floor. He raised his tablet in the air. This video you see is Jimmy's social media post. It has 3 million likes and over 200,000 comments. People see themselves in his words. If we silence him now, we will not only silence a player, but also these people. The hall suddenly fell silent. Later that afternoon, Jimmy was in a small studio in Miami with Marcus. He had been silent for some time after the CNN interview, but now he wanted to do something completely different. This wasn't a carefully planned production. He wanted to do just one thing. He wanted to reach the public directly, through the camera. Jimmy Butler placed his phone on a small tripod. He cleared his throat, took a deep breath, and began to speak. Yes, the headlines were really loud. They called it an attack. They called it disrespect. But I just told the truth. If your name isn't known, this system really crushes you. If you're poor, and you have a different skin color, especially if you don't have a passport, your future can end in an instant. Yes, I said that, because I know people who have experienced it. That's why I'm standing here, because I refuse to ignore them. I choose to see them. It only took 2 minutes, but within 4 hours, the video had reached 2.7 million views. The next morning, a statement was released from Melania Trump's office. Press Secretary Craig Bolton stepped in front of the cameras and read the following statement. As a mother, I find Mr. Butler's comments to be inappropriate for his position. I demand that our family's privacy be respected. The words were soft, but equally diplomatic. But the message was clear. Melania did not want any more talk. But at that moment, a high school student in New Mexico had set up a table in the school cafeteria. On it were written the words Jimmy had spoken. Some mothers are seen as threats. Others are protected. The only difference is money and a last name. At that moment, another student read Jimmy's post live on air. Then, looking up, he said, "We will never be silent again, because if we are silent, the fate of others will be placed on our shoulders." That same evening, a special dinner was held at the Willard Hotel in New York. Trump was sitting at the dinner table with some major donors, eating his meat with gusto, talking about Jimmy. He thinks he's so brave, but he's just a fool. Next week, no one will even remember his name. But at that moment, something else was already beginning to happen across the country. In Oakland, a child called out to his mother, "Mom, you have to come here and listen to this man." The woman came inside. Jimmy's CNN interview was being replayed, and Jimmy's words were repeated on the screen. Equality is not about punishing some people. It starts with questioning privileges. The woman sat down quietly next to her son. At that moment, She couldn't hold back her tears. "He sees us, son," she said. "He really sees us." On Sunday morning, Jimmy posted again on social media. This time, there was no political language. With a simple, tired but determined expression, he said, "News stories pass. Labels can be forgotten, but children still can't be reunited with their mothers. Even if these words destroy me, I don't care. Because as long as at least one person says, 'You saw us,' I'll know I'm in the right place." There were tens of thousands of comments below, but one stood out. "I didn't know you, but now I know you with gratitude, and I am definitely behind you." Meanwhile, Republican lawmakers in Washington weren't sitting idly by. Travis Hunt called for an urgent ethics investigation. "How can the NBA remain silent about a player who comments on his family?" he shouted. Some media outlets labeled Jimmy dangerous, but no matter how loud they shouted, they were no longer the only voices echoing in the hall. The young people, mothers, former immigrants, teachers, and athletes who were inspired by Jimmy's speeches had already started making their own videos. One person read Jimmy's speech on TikTok and ended with the following sentence: "It's definitely not Jimmy talking anymore. It's us." And something deep inside Jimmy became clear. This wasn't just a crisis. It was a breaking point. And the more it broke, the more it seemed to grow. Sports had been pushed aside. This was now a question of who was considered human. And no matter how much Jimmy was silenced, he would never back down. And he didn't. The NBA management finally made an official statement. The press release was short but effective. "It is important that the league remain neutral on social and political issues. For this reason, an ethics committee investigation has been launched into Jimmy Butler's comments." This diplomatic-sounding sentence was an open threat behind the scenes. Unable to silence Jimmy, they were now trying to corner him with league rules. That same afternoon, there was a quiet crisis meeting at the NBA's New York headquarters. The sponsors were a little worried. The management was under pressure. Silencing Jimmy had become a kind of system protection reflex. But of course, there was a different world outside. From the suburbs of Miami to New Mexico, from Brooklyn to the Arizona desert, crowds of people began to gather. Of course, it wasn't just sports fans. Immigrant families, teachers, students, farmers, and children. No one had called them, but they had all come together. They held signs they had written themselves and had one word in their hearts: "Jimmy spoke for us." A high school student in Los Angeles posted Jimmy's words on the bulletin boards at his school. "It's not enough to speak the truth quietly. Sometimes you have to shout it out loud for those who can't hear you." And finally, the call they had been waiting for from the NBA came. Disciplinary committee meeting. Location: NBA headquarters, New York. Time: 4 p.m. Agenda: Jimmy Butler's statements that were damaging to the image of his league. On the day of the meeting, hundreds, maybe even more, gathered in front of the building. They all had their own stories to tell. Some held photos of their fathers who had been deported, while others had written Jimmy's clear words from CNN on their banners. Some mothers are crying in detention centers, while others are arriving by jet. Is this justice? Jimmy was not alone inside. Representatives from the Players Union, former athletes, and several lawyers were also there. The NBA president gave a short opening speech from the podium. "Mr. Butler, as a member of the NBA family, you should be setting an example for the community. However, your statements appear to be divisive, and they have invaded the privacy of some families." Jimmy stood up. He didn't take any notes or look at any papers. He just spoke. "I didn't attack anyone. I just held up a mirror. If what they see in that mirror bothers them, the problem isn't with the mirror. The real problem is with the truth. If this league is only going to be the voice of the powerful, then why are the weak here? If I can't inspire kids playing on the streets, then why am I here right now? I'm not playing for a life of luxury. I'm here for those who played 2 seasons with 1 pair of shoes when they were kids. And I don't think I'm just playing basketball. I'm the voice of existence." The room fell silent. No one looked away, because at that moment, Jimmy was not just a player, he was the voice of conscience. And the decision came: an official warning, a disciplinary point, advice not to make any new statements to the press. But this decision did not weaken Jimmy, of course. On the contrary, it made him even more visible. That same evening, a huge mural was painted on the wall of a building in Brooklyn. It featured Jimmy's image from CNN, accompanied by the following sentence: "You can't silence me, because I'm not just expressing myself here. I'm telling your story here too." That night, Marcus handed Jimmy his phone and said, "Dude, you have to see this." On the screen was a young woman. She was giving a presentation in front of a blackboard in a classroom. The topic: Jimmy's speeches. Her voice was a little shaky, but very clear. This is what courage looks like. It's never yelling. It's not swearing. It's speaking the truth when everyone else is silent. And if someone who is being silenced is still standing, then everyone can stand up. Jimmy slowly put down the phone, his eyes filled with tears, but he didn't cry. He just took a deep breath, and a week later, the long-awaited speech came. No television, no live broadcast, just Jimmy, standing in front of the old basketball hoop in the Chicago slums where he spent his childhood. He set up his camera, he put down a chair and sat down, and he just started talking. It's a system that never sees the silent ones. But I see it, and I will continue to see it, because the truth is not something everyone loves. But I'm not here to be loved. I'm here to do what's right. This story will not end, because this is not just my story. It's your story too. In fact, it's all of our stories. Finally, he leaned toward the camera and slowly said his last sentence. The truth never waits for approval. It only requires courage. And that night, this video was shared millions of times. But this time, it wasn't for political accounts. It was the people, the kids in the neighborhood, immigrant mothers, former actors, teachers, even the janitors at the gym, because everyone knew. Jimmy had started with one sentence, but now dozens of voices were shouting alongside him. Do you think talent speaks? Or does the last name? Was Jimmy right? Let's discuss in the comments. Share this video to be the voice of young athletes, and don't forget to subscribe.